Thanks everybody for coming to the third class in our Riverside 90 years of history. Again, I'm Diane Russo. I'm director of the archives. We have Vincent Kelley, who is the archivist at Riverside. And we have a really special guest who's going to say a few words, pop in. He's popped in. He's going to be here throughout the class, and it's Dr. Ryan Harper. We're really excited. He's a professor of religious studies and our very own Reverend Lynn Castile Harper's husband. Do you want to say hi to everybody and maybe just introduce yourself, where you teach, that sort of thing?
Yes, I mean, I'm glad. I know a lot of people on this call already, so it's good to see some familiar faces. So hello, yes, I'm up in Colby College at Waterville, Maine. I teach American religious history and culture, usually classes on religion and the environment, religion and the arts, African-American religion, and religion and politics. And for those of you wondering, Lynn and I are not on the same screen. We are sitting in different rooms. So we're in different parts of the house right now. We figured we wouldn't do the shared screen thing because that would look like we're, sitting on the same side of a booth in a restaurant. So we've decided I'm in the kitchen and she's in the study.
Great, thank you. And one of the reasons that we are so excited that Dr. Harper is here is because Vince and I look at the topic of today, which is sermons, our senior ministers, Riverside's pulpit at large. From a historical point of view, purely historical, we don't have a religious history training. And so that added perspective will come from Dr. Harper, which is amazing. So we're so grateful that you could be here. Thank you. So I'll just get started with talking a little bit about our preaching ministries at Riverside. This is just a really lovely 1930s photo of our pulpit, just kind of to set the scene. This is where much of the content that we'll be talking about has occurred in our 90 years. As many of you may know, Riverside is known for its excellence in preaching. Not only from our senior ministers, but also from leaders and preachers, guest leaders and preachers from around the world. We have a host of examples, such as Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, he preached here 6 or 7 times. I should know the exact number, but 6 or 7, I'm going with that. We have Nelson Mandela, Cesar Chavez, Jesse Jackson, Desmond Tutu, Marian Wright Edelman, and all of these folks, we will actually delve into their visits and their words at a later class. So this class, we're just really going to focus on the senior minister. So don't worry, we'll get to all those wonderful folks later on. But Riverside's pulpit has been known to address critical issues of its time and to challenge the congregation to think about the issues through the lens of theology and Christianity. While Riverside's sermons may be considered prophetic in their analysis of contemporary issues that we're facing in the nation and frankly, the world at large, they were also pastoral in that they addressed the personal concerns and questions that were on the minds of worshipers throughout Riverside's history. Each senior minister has had to struggle being a pastor to his local flock, which of course is Riverside's congregation and membership, but also the larger city, nation, and again, the world, since Riverside has often been seen and kind of still is as a national cathedral for American Protestantism. So there's kind of this balance that has to be struck with each senior minister. In her assessment of Riverside's pulpit, scholar Leonora Tubbs Tisdale outlines certain traits that all of Riverside's senior ministers exhibited in their preaching ministries. And I just want to go through them. There are 9 of them. I'll read them to you. The first characteristic is a commitment to reflect theologically on the problems and issues facing city, church, nation, and world. 2, a willingness to challenge the status quo in light of larger gospel realities. 3, a belief in a God whose love embraces all races and nations and whose church is bigger than any one denomination's vision of it. 4, a concern for the societal and individual dimensions of the gospel, the prophetic, and the pastoral. 5, a wide-ranging knowledge of the Bible and an engagement of biblical themes in proclamation. 6, a sensitivity to the changing times and situations in which they lived, and an openness to altering their preaching and its emphasis, if necessary, in order to address more adequately the shifts in church and culture. 7, a willingness to enter into a dialogue through preaching with the intellectual forces of their times, whether it be science, technology, economics, politics, or literature and the arts, and to become better educated themselves in order to engage the intellectual currents of their day. 8, an ability to bring their gifts as artists to bear in sermonic language, forms, and rhetoric that have the capacity to delight their listeners as well as instruct, convict, and move them. And 9, an appreciation for the larger liturgical context in which preaching occurs and a sensitivity to the ways in which music, prayer, art, and architecture can also draw people into the presence of God. And so again, these 9 characteristics were laid out there. It's actually in our Peter J. Paris book, History of Riverside. There's a lovely chapter in which Leonora talks about each of the senior ministers, and she lays out these characteristics. So now we'll actually turn to each senior minister. We'll briefly discuss their individual preaching styles and examine selected sermons. And we'll be able to clearly see how these characteristics, these 9, kind of take form in each ministry. So of course, we'll start where we always do with Dr. Fosdick. So I will delve into a little bit about Dr. Fosdick, and since we have Dr. Harper here, he'll chime in as well. So just as an intro to Fosdick, as we discussed in the first class, Riverside was founded for the preaching ministry of Harry Emerson Fosdick. He was asked by John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the congregation at the Park Avenue Baptist Church to become our minister. And we kind of went through the backstory in the first class and how that came to be. He rejected Rockefeller 3 times for various reasons, and then eventually conceded and had requirements, namely that we were interdenominational, belief in Christ was the only thing that you had to adhere to become part of the membership. And so therein starts our church's history. He actually served from 1925 to 1946, so he had a very long tenure at Riverside. And as we mentioned again, his ministry can be found in printed sermons, in published books. He is a wide array of published material, including his sermons and then also his theological points of view as well. And then of course the radio broadcasts, which you saw the first week of class, like an example of the glass records that we have in the archive that we cannot read, we cannot access, but they're there. So in light of the radio, I just found this last week, this photo that you see on the screen. It's really cool of Fosdick and a microphone, so I thought it was kind of cool to share that with you. A cool find. So Fosdick's preaching moved beyond literalism and authoritarianism and was thoughtful and compassionate. It asked tough questions in light of modern knowledge and confronted how to live as a Christian in the modern world. He called his mode of preaching the project method, which began sermons with an examination of a real life problem that was facing people and then addressed that problem in terms of the Christian faith. He wanted to intellectually stimulate his listeners, but also transform them. He maintained that, quote, every sermon should have for its main business the head-on constructive meeting of some problem which was puzzling minds, burdening consciences, distracting lives, and no sermon which so met a real human difficulty with light to throw on it and help to win a victory over it could possibly be futile. He saw his preaching as counseling, pastoral counseling on a group scale, and used modern psychological theory in his work, which is evident in some of the titles of his sermons, such as Handling Life's Second Bests, The Curse of Cynicism, The Conquest of Fear, and When Life Goes All to Pieces. Perhaps his most famous sermon is Shall the Fundamentalists Win?, which was preached in May 1922 at the First Presbyterian Church. We discussed this sermon briefly in the first class. I basically gave like a very, very short summary of it, but it bears revisiting here, especially with the added perspective of Dr. Ryan Harper. So I'll let you take it away and
just kind of fill everybody in. I mean, I'm sure there are, again, people in the room who know a little of the story of this sermon. It's a fun one to start with because obviously this is a sermon given before there is a Riverside church. And I think it's probably a little hyperbolic to say, but it's, you know, worth maybe thinking about from a provocative standpoint. In some ways, this is a sermon that creates the pulpit at Riverside Church. And a lot of what Rockefeller's project was is really goes back to his response to this fundamentalist modernist controversy in history. So I'm just going to say maybe a brief word about that, where this sermon lands in it, and some of the aftermath, and also maybe speak a little bit about some of the terminology we see both Fosdick use and what's going on in this era that doesn't quite map onto the 21st century. Language about fundamentalism, modernism, and you'll notice that Fosdick uses the word evangelical for himself a lot too. So this is actually a sermon that appears a little late in the fundamentalist modernist controversy. It's been raging for some time between two camps of Protestant Christians. And usually it's a white Protestant Christian conversation. This is really a battle that's taking place in the northern, mostly northern denominations at this point. The Presbyterians, the Baptists, and Methodists all have their version of this controversy. Really what's at stake is, well, the word fundamental sums it up. There are a camp of people who say that in order to call yourself a Christian, there are a few points of doctrine that you have to check off. These are the things that are considered fundamental to being a Christian. So fundamentalism at this point is actually in some ways, at least the fundamentalists themselves saw themselves as an intellectual defense of Orthodox Christianity against maybe our presuppositions about what the word fundamentalism signals now, this kind of anti-intellectual, stodgy, conservative thing. At least in their own minds, early fundamentalists were thinking we're offering a rigorous defense that starts with certain presuppositions about the faith. These included the virgin birth of Christ. These included substitutionary atonement, this notion that Jesus died on people's sins and affected some sort of change in people. It also included things about miracles in the Bible, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. But perhaps the big kicker, the one that really is key to all of this, the big umbrella thing, is the inerrancy of the Bible. While there is variety inside fundamentalism at this point about that belief, there is a sense that we have to believe the Bible is divinely inspired. This was a rejection of a new kind of historical critical scholarship, mainly coming out of Germany, that said we can view the Bible as a flawed historical document, perhaps still having some authority, but one we need to investigate like we would any piece of history, any kind of document that's coming to us from the past. Fundamentalists said, no, 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 that's a problem. We challenge that. And you need to be able to sort of say yes to the virgin birth, to the miracles, and certainly to the inerrancy of the Bible on these matters. Modernists, as a rule, usually said we don't have to believe those things. And you'll notice they didn't, modernists of Fosdick's bent, while they probably were a little more skeptical about the Bible's authorship, they were probably a little more skeptical or at least agnostic about miracles and things like that. Really the key for Fosdick, and you'll notice this when you read the sermon, is what we're going to say is incumbent upon Christians to be called such. You'll notice that if you read the sermon, Fosdick seems to be saying fundamentalists, theologically, could be a part of my church. I believe that modernists and fundamentalists can sit in the pews by one another and call themselves Christians. And his problem with fundamentalism was not so much the beliefs in this or that. His problem was that they are being exclusionary. They're trying to draw a fence around Christianity where none should exist. So that was really the battle. And this is a battle that's about control of the major mainline pulpits. It's a battle that's about who's teaching in the seminaries. A year after this is published, Fosdick's big worries about the exclusionary principles of fundamentalism are really going to come to fruition, because there's going to be a guy named J. Gresham Machen, this New Testament scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary, who's going to write a book called Christianity and Liberalism. And the main thesis of that book is that liberals can be nice, they can be fine people, but this thing called liberal Christianity, it is tantamount to atheism. It's a counterfeit Christianity. These people should not be able to count themselves as Christian. So that's what's at stake here. You'll notice perhaps too, we're not yet talking about evolution and things like that. Scopes trial's a few years away. That really wasn't part of the discussion quite yet in the way that it would become really for the next couple decades here. And you'll also notice too that Fosdick, I think this is one of the more fascinating things. He uses the word evangelical in the kind of first person singular and plural here. So we don't yet have the presupposition that evangelical and fundamentalists are on this natural continuum. Fosdick is still going to self-identify as a kind of evangelical in this text. Now, we could talk a little bit about what he does and doesn't mean by that. He never makes it clear. He might mean something as broad as a Protestant denomination, evangelical in kind of the German sense. But he might also mean something as narrow as someone who thinks Jesus Christ has a claim on your life, and that you still hold the Bible in high regard and is authoritative, even if you might not feel like the history is all there in place. But he's using a term there that, again, in his mind, this is still a battle for evangelical Christianity, rather than a battle against evangelicals for this other thing. So it's complicated to think about this. This, of course, got Fosdick in a lot of trouble at the Presbyterian Church. He's not a Presbyterian minister, but he's preaching at this church. He resigns before things get really messy, and he's probably going to get called before a council. And Rockefeller, of course, catches his eye, or Rockefeller becomes aware of him at Park Avenue Baptist later on, wants him to become a part of this new project. So he's got Standard Oil money behind him. I'll mention real briefly, the fundamentalist had a guy named Lyman Stewart behind them, an oil magnate from the West Coast, when they published their original pamphlets in the 1910, 1915s. They're later going to have a guy named George Pepperdine behind them too. So in the discussion, we could talk a little bit about who's funding all of this too. It's an oil battle in some ways. And so you've got Pepperdine and Stewart out on the West Coast, and you've got Rockefeller over here. That's the energy that's behind this. That's the money that's behind this. Into this fray, we see Harry Emerson Fosdick.
Can you hear me? Yes, great. Thank you. That was amazing. Does anyone have any questions? I feel like I have a million. But does anybody want to ask any questions while we're on this before we move on to another Fosdick topic sermon? Does anybody have anything they want to ask? We have an expert here, so now would be the time. And of course, if you have questions, as the previous classes throughout, you can also use the chat feature or do the hand wave or putting your hand up. No, okay. So we'll move on. Yeah, I'll let you digest.
My hand is up.
Oh,
my hand is up.
I didn't see that. Go ahead, please.
That's okay. I just wonder if you can expound a bit more. You lost me at oil companies being in this conversation.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of mentioned that pretty quickly at the end there. I think it's always important that when we talk about any sort of theological debates that we remember these are also power plays. These are about controls of institutions largely. And often the winners and losers, I mean, it's important to have backing from powerful people. So in 1910, there's a guy from Texas, an oil tycoon named Lyman Stewart, who's fundamentalist in his theology. And he decides he's going to get on the horn with all of these fundamentalist theologians and biblical scholars, and he's going to fund the publication of a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals of the Faith. And so there's several of these, there's a bunch of them that come out, and these get disseminated all over the place, largely because of Stewart's money. They're able to disseminate this stuff, and these are people saying, here's why these particular points matter to call yourself a Christian, widespread approval. Of course, fast forward, you get Rockefeller, he's got all kinds of money. This Riverside Church is, of course, built on, probably don't have to go into this part of it as much, but the fact that the Rockefeller family has more of the modernist bent, and that they're seeing their funds as trying to, they're going to want to use their funds to get behind the modernist camp and sort of fund modernist institutions. Pretty important to the story too. I mean, the University of Chicago Divinity School in some ways exists because of the Rockefellers too, which is going to be this bastion for modernist Christianity.
Great, thank you. I have a question for you. So you're talking about 1910s is when these series of pamphlets come out. Fosdick's addressing this in the 20s, 1922 to be exact. And you mentioned evolution hadn't yet played a part while Fosdick is preaching this. How long after the 20s did this continue and kind of be a real struggle within American Protestantism? Like what's the timeline that we're talking and where did it go?
Well, if you look at what's going on in the world today, you could say, well, till 2020, right?
Right.
I mean, there's versions of this still going on. I think it changes, the sort of manifestations of it and the alliances change a little bit. Are you asking, Diane, like when the evolution stuff especially, or?
Yeah, because some of my own readings, it mentioned like Darwin's theory became a big role, the age of the earth. And so it's interesting to me that you mentioned like that comes a little bit later. And so when does that come into play? And is Fosdick a part of that as well?
Yeah, I think it's going to have something to do with the Southernization of the story. You'll notice I mentioned a lot of this is battles inside Northern denominations for a while. So that's going to play a big part of it. I mean, it was probably on a collision course. The Origin of Species didn't quite make waves in American institutions of higher learning as quickly as it did in the British Empire. So the issue of Genesis and creation and stuff wasn't really part of it. And I'll say this too, the early fundamentalists, if you read those early pamphlets published 1910 to 1915, it's shocking how little creation and evolution are mentioned. There's only one article about it at all. Most of the articles are talking at the level of, how should we approach scripture generally? There's only one article that's about evolution, and it's actually fairly conciliatory. The guy writes in a way that says there's a version of evolution that is compatible with an inerrantist fundamentalist reading of scripture. So think about that in light of what's going to happen, decades later, the sort of famous Scopes monkey trial and things like that. So I think it has something to do with the battle moving south, the battle going probably into education, and perhaps there was always a little bit of a collision course happening with people who had a very strong inerrantist view, who were going to want to read like Genesis 1 and 2 as 6-day creation stories. They were going to, the higher critical approach to the Bible was always going to rankle them, right? And it turns out that battle really takes place in places like Tennessee and in the schoolrooms.
A question from Linda Freeman, Ryan, could you expand a little bit on the trouble that Fosdick got into for his more modernist views?
Yeah, I can do a little bit, although I do, again, know there are people in this room that I would open it up to who might know a little bit more about the specifics here. So when this sermon specifically was given at First Pres, there's some people at the church who it rankles, who have some power. And remember, this is a time when there's a battle inside Presbyterianism about who's going to control these things, the modernist camp or the fundamentalists. So there are some fundamentalist leaning people who hear this. They want to, they let the sort of higher ups in the Presbyterian church know about it. So there's a conversation, are we going to bring this guy to a kind of trial, right? Are we going to issue a censure for him? Luckily, Fosdick has some powerful people in his corner, one of them being John Foster Dulles, who goes to that church. I think, again, the decision is made, and we're all church people here, right? We know how sometimes you just like try to back out of the room, or if you can find a way to bypass the conflict, you do. Fosdick, I think, was seeing the writing on the wall at the Presbyterian church. He also didn't want to, I think, cause a problem. I think my sense is that he always felt a little bit like an outsider in the Presbyterian church anyway. So he just sort of backed out. He went to Park Avenue Baptist so that he didn't get involved in this very internecine Presbyterian dispute. But of course, he made a name for himself in that sermon and other things he did kind of throughout the land as this person who was defending this modernist Christianity. And again, I'll say defending modernism, but really defending the notion that modernism was a properly inclusive style of Christianity.
Great, thank you. So we'll go on to the next sermon of Fosdick, and then Penelope, I do see your comment in the chat. Please, let's do the questions at the end of the material. I'm so anxious to have Dr. Harper's take on the preaching. So we will continue on. What I'll do is I'll have since this is Dr. Harper's specialty, that's why I wanted to take questions on this here. What I'll do is, as we go through each senior minister, I'll take a moment at the end of discussion on each one for you to ask any questions before we move on to the next minister. I think that might make sense, so that folks are we're still on the same page and we're not jumping around ministries, unless of course that is a question that you have, like comparisons. Okay. So now I'll just talk very briefly about Fosdick's pacifism. So he was well known for this and for his anti-war sermons. We talked a little bit about this in the first class. This really grew out of his experiences in World War I, when he ministered to American troops for the British Ministry of Information and the YMCA in 1918. One of his most famous sermons was The Unknown Soldier. So you just see a picture of it here. It was delivered for Memorial Day in November of 1933, after celebrations around the memorials of the unknown soldier. In the sermon, Fosdick actually repents his own pro-war stance, and he calls himself a gullible fool and someone who should have known better. Because again, he's lamenting his participation in the war, in which he explicitly states that he encouraged men to fight, to murder, and to die, essentially. He let his congregation know that he had an account to settle between his soul and that of the unknown soldier. So that's kind of a line that he repeats throughout the sermon, like, I have an account to settle. So it's like, why am I doing this? Why do I feel this way? When he recounts his participation in the war, he says, quote, one night in a ruined barn behind the lines, I spoke at sunset to a company of hand grenaders who were going out that night to raid the German trenches. They told me that on the average, no more than half a company came back from such a raid, and I, a minister of Christ, tried to nerve them for their suicidal and murderous endeavor. I wonder if the unknown soldier was in the barn that night. I felt this was a really powerful, I think the whole sermon is really powerful, coming from a historical point of view, and even a personal point of view. So I struggled on what excerpts or what quotes to share with you, but this one was one I felt was really powerful, because he takes accountability in this one. I think he says, I am minister of Christ, tried to nerve them for their suicidal and murderous endeavor. He's taking accountability. He's recognizing that he partook in this system of war. And we know, based on the first part of this quote, that most of the men in this company died. And he knows it. And now we know it too. He's telling this to us. He's telling us, he's making us confront the fact that these are real people, this group of hand grenaders, and most of them are dead. And that's just a fact. And he partook in that occurrence. So I thought that was just really powerful. He does this a lot throughout the sermon. He explains the horrors that he witnessed. He uses logic in many areas to explain why war is absurd and evil. He says how it wore men down and it used men for ungodly deeds. So the second quote on the screen is, "O war, I hate you most for all of this, that you do lay your hands on the noblest elements in human character, which we might make a heaven on earth, and you use them to make a hell on earth instead." Again, very powerful. The elements that he's talking about, he goes into a little bit more depth before this, is like things like courage and loyalty, things that you associate with heroes and soldiers. And he's asking you, instead of looking at those elements as a hero who's participating in war, think of them instead of what we're doing with those elements. we could be using them for good. We, society, governments could be using them for good, but we're using them for bad, and that is for war. So, of course, he ends the sermon by renouncing war and encouraging all Christians to do the same. His account is with the unknown soldier. The account of his soul with that of the unknown soldier is, he mentions it is being settled by his pacifism. That is what he promises to do. And that is how he tries to settle this account that he has for his participation. So I mentioned before, this is just one of many anti-war sermons. We also have Christianity in War, a plea for pacifism, which was delivered at the League of Nations service in Geneva on September 13th, 1925. I want to thank Penelope, you're here. Thank you for sharing that with me. Penelope and I have been, emailing back and forth. She loves Fosdick and knows very much about him. So she shared that sermon with me. There's also on the screen here, you can see a Christian crusade against war that was delivered as the Armistice Day sermon at the First Presbyterian Church on November 11th, 1923. Then we have the Church of Christ in a Warring World delivered at Riverside on December 14th, 1941. So think about that date, December 14th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is, the US is entering the war. And A Time to Stress Unity, which was delivered at Riverside in 1945 at the end of World War II. So if you think about Fosdick's ministry, it spans many wars. And so he has a lot of material to work with when he's talking about anti-war. So that's what we have for Fosdick. There's so many other facets of his ministry, obviously, that we can't get to. It's a survey style course. But if anybody has any questions now before we move on to Fosdick, please let us know. You can, again, use the chat, you can raise your hand, or you could just unmute yourself and ask. Okay, John, I see you raising, yep.
I read somewhere that Dr. Fosdick shared with a number of his colleagues that during World War II, he was getting on in years, but he was not going to retire during the war because he felt people would get the impression that Riverside had unloaded this pacifist minister, so that he wanted to stay until the war was over.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We have Craig Lemley. He's asked in the chat, how did the church react to this anti-war message during World War II? That's an interesting question. So I can answer from the historic point of view and what I know. As many of you know, there was the midshipmen's class that was a big part of Riverside's community. There were many Navy men who were coming to the church from Columbia to use our spaces, to use Riverside during the war. And many of them actually got married in our church before they shipped out. And so there was participation of Riverside in World War II home front sort of activities. And Fosdick welcomed these folks. So it wasn't as though the Riverside, he told everyone at Riverside, we can't participate in the home front. We can't do these sorts of things. So Riverside at the same time was active and was taking care of the military men. In terms of the congregation's direct response to this, I'm not 100% sure. I don't know that I've seen that. Does anybody out here know? I know a lot of you are also knowledgeable about Fosdick. So if anybody wants to contribute to that, but as far as I know, in the records that I haven't seen anything as a direct response. Is that Penelope?
Yes. Fosdick himself was afraid that Riverside might let him go, so he had a plan B to join the Quakers, but it didn't happen. So clearly, whatever the feeling about it, it wasn't strong enough to oust him. but he wasn't sure. He really wasn't sure.
Mhm. Yeah.
Maybe Dr. Harper has something more to say.
No, I'm just smiling. That's, yeah. The Quakers would have been the refuge, right?
Yeah. Okay, great. And I mean, I think Riverside hosting these Navy men and Fosdick having this point of view, this pacifism is similar into like what Dr. Harper was talking about, like it's saying that he's not saying that the fundamentalists can't be part of his congregation, right? As you were saying before, that they can coexist on the pew. So sort of like, we could have these in World War II, it's seeming that we can have these Navy men, these soldiers be part of the Riverside community. It's not as though because he's anti-war, we can't allow these folks, these men, we can't blame them as the ones who are perpetuating this. So I think that's interesting. Carol White in the chat has said there's a memorial plaque on the wall in the nave memorializing the midshipmen's class. Yep, there is. I think it's in the back on, I want to say the west side. I think, yep, John is saying yep. Okay, great. So I think we'll move on to our next senior minister, which is McCracken. So McCracken was, let's see, sorry. He was a Scottish-born pastor, and he was a professor of Christian theology and philosophy of religion before he came to Riverside. He was with us from 1946 to 1967. During his 21-year tenure, his sermons addressed a wide variety of relevant issues such as racism, McCarthyism, space exploration, and the Korean War. Early on in his career, he was an expository preacher, meaning he would move from the exposition of a biblical text to a theological analysis of the text, then to an application of its meaning to the lives of his congregation. While he was at Riverside, though, he switched his style to what he called a life situation preaching. And there he would start his sermon out with a live issue, whether it be personal, social, theological, or ethical, and then would work out the solution with a biblical revelation, much like Fosdick. So this is one of those characteristics that I mentioned before that the scholar had laid out. He's adapting for the Riverside congregation. They're very used to Fosdick at this point. So he actually switches his preaching style, which is very interesting. His preaching ministry was different from Fosdick's in a way that it was had more of a theological focus. And that could be seen in some of his sermon titles, such as Aspects of the Teaching of Jesus, What is Meant by the Will of God, and What Kind of God Do You Believe? How Do You Think of Death? That one's here on the center. And Can Human Nature Be Changed? That's also here. His sermons also considered doctrine a little bit more than Fosdick's did. This can be seen in some of the sermons, such as the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, which we have here, the Reformation and the Bible, and where Protestants differ from Roman Catholics and why. So just a little bit of the differences between the two. McCracken also placed more emphasis on personal morality, which can be seen in a sermon series on the 7 deadly sins. We have only 3 of them here because I can only fit 3 on a slide. We've got envy, lust, and gluttony. And then he also had a series of the cardinal virtues, the 7 cardinal virtues. And this is courage and hope here. Also note the different ways in which the printed materials look. We have a wealth of formats from McCracken. So things that were little pamphlets like this, and also sort of kind of like the typescript of his notes. We've got all of that. So these series in particular were very popular, and he gave them more than once, and also on the radio. and here he is. So I think it's important to also note that, like Fosdick, he took his ministry to the radio and was a voice of the national radio Pulpit. So his ministry, again, this kind of balance between preaching to the local congregation and then the world at large. Looking at the time period in which McCracken ministered Riverside, it's no surprise he often preached on racial issues. He declared racism a sin. In February 1954, he gave a sermon, you can see here, Discrimination, the Shame of Sunday Morning, where he discussed the church's role in segregation and discrimination against African Americans. He starts out very strong in the intro. He starts with, quote, "There is more Jim Crowism in America at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning than at any other time. Nobody can refute the truth of the statement. It is a fact, shameful and shocking, that if we look at American life in general, racial discrimination is now nowhere more in evidence than in the churches." So again, starting out, he's not pulling any punches. He's starting out very, very strongly with the sermon. And he laments that instead of leading the cause of equality and civil rights, which was, kind of, we're in the 50s, so it's really beginning to start and, go into what it was in the 60s. But he's saying the Protestant church in America was actually upholding the status quo and even perpetuating racism, and was lagging behind other industries at the time. So he named organized labor, commerce, education, sports, and politics. Those are the industries he names in the sermon in particular. And he calls for action in the churches. He says, quote, "It is not enough to preach the gospel and advocate the need of understanding, tolerance, brotherhood. The preaching and the advocacy ought to result in action, personal and concerted action." And at one point later on in the sermon, the quote's not here, but he says that it would be very much like a conversion, like Christianity sort of needs a conversion for it to take into this, sorry, I'm admitting somebody, this idea of equality. And he's talking about this in the time of Brown versus the Board of Ed. So again, the early civil rights in the 50s. And him preaching this sermon at this time shows that he wanted participation from Riverside and its congregation in social justice, and for Christians to not just be observers, but to be activists and to actually help to affect change. There's also another quote here that I just really like, so I just added it in the presence of God, distinctions of class and race count for nothing. God has no favorites. I just really kind of dug that, so I just threw that in here. Okay, so before we go on, other notable sermons that he preached that were addressing contemporary issues, I'll just briefly mention two, was the Christian attitude towards communism that was preached in October 1948, and he basically said communism is heresy. That was his main point on that one. And then he addressed Vietnam. So he preached the war in Vietnam in January 1966. It's interesting that he was very ambiguous in this one. He preached it because there was a call for it from the congregation. So folks were asking him, like, please address this, please address the war. And he basically lays out the pros and the cons, but it doesn't seem as though he comes to a conclusion himself in this sermon in particular. Okay, so do we have any questions? Emily Anderson asked in the chat, can we hear a bit more from Ryan on this? Ryan, would you like to?
I think a little. I mean, what's funny, I say a little because I think one thing I feel, and I realize this reading some of McCracken's stuff, he's, I think, the victim of some overlooking in the historical and theological records, because he's wedged between Fosdick, Coffin, and I eventually think the legacy of Forbes is going to kind of steamroll things too. These kind of major figures who were in the pulpit for a while. So there hasn't been a lot of attention to McCracken in my field. I think it's worth, I mean, I like that Diane used that. He's kind of safe in that Vietnam speech, and he's a sermon, and he's giving it a year before King's going to come up and be very unsafe in the same space, right, with his call against his speech against Vietnam. He's also writing at a time when in mainline Protestantism, I think Niebuhrian ethics is really sort of in vogue. So Reinhold Niebuhr Way, we've probably all seen that sign up along by Riverside Church. I think there's a sense in which being safe in the Cold War era meant being an equal opportunity critic of communism and capitalism, but in practice, often it meant preaching especially heavily against communism. So he's working in a space where this sort of careful middle seems to be very cachet in mainline Protestant theological circles. And the theological backing behind it is a guy like Reinhold Niebuhr, who does a very sophisticated job of saying, we always have to be on the lookout for sin and ideology. There's this real emphasis on self-critique and self-examination. So I think that's the sort of license given sometimes for good and for ill to speak a kind of safe language and to sort of let the default spirit of the time sort of prevail.
Thank you. Does anybody have any more questions? Yep, John?
More minutia. I arrived at Riverside in 1970, so that was not long after Dr. McCracken had retired. And one of the things that I learned from one of the other members shortly after I arrived was that about 2/3 of the way through Dr. McCracken's ministry, he was trying to resign because he was exhausted. And so the trustees sprang into action, and they contacted him and said that they agreed that he had been working too hard, and the trustees would like to send him and his wife on a first-class cruise around the world for 90 days so he could have a nice rest. And that's what they did.
Thank you for that. I do remember seeing that somewhere. That's yes. Thank you.
Is that still an available clergy perk? I'm just asking for a friend.
I don't know.
Okay. Do we have anybody else before we move on? I'm just doing a quick scan. I think we're good to go. Okay, so now I'm going to kick it over to Vince, and he's going to talk about Campbell, and take it away.
So Ernest T. Campbell was born and raised right in Morningside Heights, and he was the first non-Baptist minister at Riverside Church. He was Presbyterian. And although he grew up a fundamentalist, he later rejected it and embraced the more modernist approach. Campbell was senior minister at Riverside during an extremely tumultuous time in the nation's history. And his ministry was influenced by the issues at the time, especially the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Freedom Struggle, the Kent State Massacre, and Watergate, among other things. And additionally, there were issues within American Protestantism itself at the time, with debates arguing over whether the church's mission should be social justice or evangelism. And at this time, preaching itself also sort of came under attack as people began to consider it authoritarian, outmoded, or irrelevant. 6 months into Campbell's ministry, very early on, James Foreman interrupted the worship service on Sunday, May 4th, 1969, to deliver his Black Manifesto. This is an event we celebrated at Riverside last year for the 50th anniversary. And Foreman demanded that churches and synagogues, especially Riverside Church, pay $500 million in reparations to African Americans for the injustice they'd endured throughout the nation's history. So in the wake of this event, which obviously was so significant, it was, a New York Times headline the next day. But 10 weeks later, Campbell preached the case for reparations and argued for reparations using the Zacchaeus story from the New Testament. In this story, Jesus forgives and extends God's grace to a tax collector who responds by making restitution to those he has defrauded. Campbell continues his sermon by stating that African Americans have been discriminated against throughout the history of the country, and he brings contemporary Americans to account. He says, "Surely it is beyond dispute by now that the white man in this country has not done right by the black man. Before a black child says his first word or takes his first step in our society, he is handicapped. The discrimination we work is sometimes personal and always systemic. That system dates back to slavery, which was instituted by our fathers, but it has been perpetuated and confirmed by us, their sons, to our political, material, and social advantage." Campbell then lists the numerous ways in which Americans have sinned and how the church and more generally Christians have failed. He discusses the need for reparations, yet he also disavows the idea of revolution, which was mentioned in the Black Manifesto. He believed that making reparations should not be tied to with revolution, but with reconciliation. He was, in fact, very critical of the Black Manifesto when he said, quote, "Tragically, the Black Manifesto puts two loyalties on a collision course, a belated loyalty to the black man in his quest for justice and a loyalty to country. Reparations, yes. Revolution, no. As clearly as I can, I want to say that no funds that I give, no funds that I raise, no funds over which I have an influence will be used for the destruction or overthrow of this government. I believe we need reform. I believe we stand in need of drastic overhaul and renewal from the inside out, but I don't believe God is yet finished with this republic." Despite not directly addressing the crux of the Black Manifesto's demands and largely disagreeing with it, Riverside did later respond with the Black Christian Caucus and the Riverside Fund for Social Justice. Later on, in light of the Vietnam War in May 1972, Campbell preached the urge to win and the need for peace, where he made a case against the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. Later that year, in December 1972, he delivered an open letter to Billy Graham, where he castigated Graham for refusing to join other religious leaders in urging President Nixon to stop bombing North Vietnam. He highlighted Graham's unique position and influence as friend to the president and urged him to utilize that position to effect change. He told Graham that the president needs a Micaiah, not a Zedekiah, a prophet, not a mere house chaplain. In May 1973, Campbell addressed the Watergate issue with his sermon entitled "Watergate, Under God and All That." In February 1974, he delivered a sermon on homosexuality called "Overheard in Room 738." The latter sermon was progressive in that it dealt with the subject most preachers would not address for another decade. The sermon told of an imaginary conversation between a liberal, a conservative, and a chaplain in a hospital as they discuss homosexuality. Campbell concludes the sermon by advocating for tolerance of homosexuality and the blessing of same-sex unions. As these sermons indicate, it's clear that Campbell wanted to move the church beyond social service to social action, but was also something of a moderating influence at the time during tremendous social upheaval throughout the country. While many of these sermons shed light on the public witness of his ministry, it should be noted that many of his other sermons were geared towards evangelism, pastoral care, or issues of personal piety. He dealt more with biblical texts than did Fosdick and McCracken, and often began the sermon with a reference to the day's biblical text and then talked about its meaning for life issues. Other sermons he did vice versa, and still others he used different texts from scripture to build a case. He believed in textual preaching versus Fosdick and McCracken's homiletical practice. Do we have any questions, or did Ryan want to jump in and offer any thoughts about Campbell?
Just say again that I think, like McCracken, he's one of the voices that gets erased a little bit between Fosdick and Coffin. Unlike, though, McCracken, I think, again, and even in the samples that you all chose, here a little bit more bravery to, come out, especially in the case for reparations. At the same time, you hear some of that safety, and you've got to remember, this is a time at Riverside Church. This is when mainline Protestantism, in some ways, was the institutional ecclesial face of mainstream America, or at least mainstream white America. So that making sure everyone knew we were still nice and American and not Marxist and not revolutionaries was, of course, even in a sermon that's otherwise pretty brave, we might say, especially for that time, there's this nod toward the fact that we're still, a proper people that won't get involved in revolution.
I'm just going to answer Craig. Dates at Riverside, 1968 to 1976. Penelope, do you have your hand raised? Do you want to comment or ask a question?
My question is, what's the percentage of the congregation that is Black under Fosdick, McCracken, and now Campbell? Do we know?
That's a really great question, and I don't know off the top of my head. I wonder if, I mean, that would take research in the archives. I don't know that I've read anywhere that percentage has been calculated. I'm sure we could find it, but off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yeah, or just any sense of it is what I'm curious about.
Towards the 60s, I think 60s and 70s, we start to see a lot more, but I think in Fosdick's time, I mean, sorry to say, but Fosdick and McCracken's time, when we look at the old photographs, it's mostly white. And I think that's indicative.
In 1970, when I arrived, the African-American contingent was certainly about 5%.
Yeah.
1970.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not until the later 60s, 70s, 80s that we see a shift. And that's only me purely saying, with John's addition, from looking at the photographs, the archival photographs that we have in the archive.
Yeah, okay, that answers. Thank you.
Okay.
We had 2 African-American ushers at that time in 1970, and they were both doormen.
We'll talk about the ushers in another class. That's the ushers are a fascinating group. Okay. If we don't have any other questions, we do. When were women first permitted to usher? And when did ushers stop wearing morning coats and gloves? I have no idea. Does anyone, John, do you know?
It was one of Dr. Campbell's missions to get these men out of their morning coats. And I think it was after John D. Rockefeller Jr. died and before 1970 that took place. Because when I arrived in 1970, the morning coats were in the lockers, but not used.
Okay. And do you know when women were first permitted?
In the early 70s.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So I think we'll go on to Coffin. Vince, you want to take it away?
Sure. So when William Sloane Coffin Jr. first became senior minister, the era of true activism, or a much more vocally activist pulpit at Riverside began. Before coming to Riverside, Coffin had served as chaplain at the Yale University Chapel and was a nationally known activist at that time already, particularly against the Vietnam War and segregation and racism. He had been very publicly advised Yale students not to avoid the draft as best they could. I believe he also burned some draft cards, stuff like that. And he was also arrested. I assume this is the photo. He was arrested during the freedom rides going down into the South to register people to vote. Coffin had an unusual path to the ministry. He had first intended to become a concert pianist, and he had served in World War II, and he had anticipated a career in diplomacy. He came from a very wealthy and well-known family. His father was the president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and his uncle was the president of Union Theological Seminary. And I believe his grandfather or great-grandfather had started a chain of department stores. So wealthy, prominent New York City family. And so he was anticipating a career in diplomacy, and he had even worked with the CIA in the Korean War. But then later on in the 60s, he took this more activist bent, arrested during the Civil Rights Movement on rides. And ultimately, he decided on a life of ministry when he attended a conference on ministry at Union Theological Seminary. His preaching challenged the church to move beyond nationalism, militarism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and anything else that was blocking humans from loving the world. He advocated for work on structural changes to ensure justice and peace. In terms of style, Coffin was known for being engaging and unpredictable, as well as poetic. Throughout his time at Riverside, Coffin was not afraid to attack the issues facing the nation and the world at large, no matter how controversial they were. A look at some of his sermon titles show this, just including abortion, Iran, homosexuality, AIDS. In his AIDS sermon, Coffin criticized the treatment of those dying of AIDS by the medical field, critique the medical field, the government, and society at large for their failure. He dispels the idea that AIDS is a gay disease or a divine retribution on homosexuals, and says, if doctors don't know the cause of AIDS, ministers don't either. He warns the congregation against blinding themselves to other humans' needs, and declares that it was by showing and giving love that the AIDS hysteria could be mitigated and support could be given to those suffering. He ends the sermon by inviting Jim Johnson, a member of the congregation with AIDS, to talk about his experience and what Christians could do to support those like him. Keeping a pulse on contemporary issues and an ardent believer in disarmament, the Riverside Disarmament program was established and run during his time at Riverside. Coffin often preached on the subject. An example is the sermon, "It's a Sin to Build a Nuclear Weapon," originally delivered at the World Council of Churches hearing on nuclear weapons and disarmament in Amsterdam. Although Coffin's sermons were highly geared towards societal and public issues, one of his most famous sermons dealt with a very personal subject, death. Preached in 1983, a 4-year-old son's, addresses Coffin's own anguish at his 24-year-old son's death by car accident 2 weeks before. He confronts the issue that deaths such as this were the will of God. He says, for some reason, nothing so infuriates me as the incapacity of seemingly intelligent people to get it through their heads that God doesn't go around this world with his finger on triggers, his fist around knives, his hands on steering wheels. God is dead set against all unnatural deaths, and Christ spent an inordinate amount of time delivering people from paralysis, insanity, leprosy, and muteness. My own consolation lies in knowing that it was not the will of God that Alex die, that when the waves closed over the sinking car, God's heart was the first of all of our hearts to break. At the end of the sermon, Coffin speaks of consolation and love, giving hope to those others sharing the pain of similar tragedies. With that, do we have any questions? Or Ryan, would you like to jump in and offer anything about Coffin?
Certainly like to thank you all for bringing up, I like this sample of sermon, because here we have a guy who's very public, right? And to pick this intimate piece that was also famous, but also, for different reasons is good. A good reminder that all of these ministers we've talked about have this local and national ministry, right? So it could swing very personal and pastoral at some points, and then swing very national and macro. I think I would actually like to invite, I know now we're getting into the period where a lot of people on this call might be around, what it meant to hear a minister in New York City in the 80s say what he did about the HIV/AIDS crisis, given what else was happening in some of the parishes, dioceses, pulpits of New York City. I mean, I'd actually be curious to hear from people about sort of the climate into which that sermon and that, series of statements came.
It fit right into the context of things that were happening at Riverside. Maranatha had started a few years prior, and anyone who was really conservative would not have been around Riverside anyway. They were long gone, okay? So it was not considered outrageous.
I wasn't obviously there for the sermon, probably wasn't even alive. But when I read it, one of the reasons that I wanted to include it was I actually read it for the first time probably when I was at Riverside, maybe like a couple months. And I had taken my laptop. I was in the second balcony overlooking the nave. So kind of this like amazing atmosphere, trying to imagine what it would have been like. And what really struck me was him sharing the pulpit with this man and having this man give his own witness, his own testimony. It's really touching, and it's really giving that community, which I guess at that time, again, this was before my time, maybe didn't have a voice, or their voices weren't heard. As from what he says in the sermon, you know, they were kicked out of their hospital beds. They were kicked out of their apartments, and they were kind of left to fend for themselves. And so he gave this man a voice to tell about what he was going through. I found that really powerful, and you know, I can only imagine what it was like to be in the nave. I tried to recreate it, but of course it was just me by myself and my computer, but it must have been really amazing. So that's one of the reasons why this sermon in particular really drew me in.
Well, Mace Anderson here. I was here. I was at Riverside during that time, and he preached a sermon on AIDS, but there was also Channing Phillips' sermon on homosexuality, which caused gigantic, how can I say, furor at the church. And there, at that point, Coffin and Phillips and Jean Laubach each preached sermons on homosexuality, and in fact a booklet was published with all three sermons included. So it was more or less 2 against 1. But in those days of AIDS, I mean, I remember so well. I mean, there, you know, I won't say many, but several folk in the columbarium right now. I mean, Reverend Fanny Erickson, who, a wonderful woman still, did a lot of memorial services and funerals for people, some of whom belonged to other churches, who refused to participate in those rites. So it was really, you know, it was a sad time, but we were, I won't say proud, but perhaps proud is the right word, that we were there on the forefront of religious response to the crisis. And it's one of the reasons that I'm still a member, actually. So that's it for me.
Thank you, May. Sorry, I realized I was muted. Linda, do you have a comment or a question?
Were you speaking to me? I'm sorry. No.
Okay.
I was just going to make a plug for Maranatha, because they had as much to do with the readiness of the church to realize the you know, the full humanity of all of their members and others like them, as did the preachers. So I don't know, Mace would know what's the date it was actually founded, but I think it was in the 80s, even before Coffin came. So I'm putting a plug for a non-preacher there, but the church itself had a lot of encouragement from Maranatha, at the same time as there was definitely, you know, a suspicious streak. And one of the ministers was handed something on her way out of the church in the procession, which suggested that the youth might be in danger of being converted to this. So there was those little free songs in Riverside at the time, which were quite quickly overcome. Okay.
Well, I don't know about how quickly, but and whether they've been overcome. But that sermon that Channing Phillips preached,
Yes.
you know, caused the church to have a lot of conversations. We were sitting around tables. That's what we do, sitting around talking, and hopefully opening up people's minds. So it did have an effect. Without the sermon, those folks concerned about their children and all would you know, it would be, I won't say in the closet or undercover, but this sermon was really, I guess, God given, because it broke the egg and we had to deal with the aftermath. So in a way, it was good. We sat around for months and months talking to people who, you know, were our friends, but we had no idea what their views were on the subject. We're getting off of sermons, so you know, we could talk about that in another venue.
Okay.
But thank you, Susan, for giving us credit.
Linda Lewis, do you have I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just a comment. I happen to have been in the nave the day that Reverend Coffin preached Alex's death. And I think it brought every one of us who was there to tears. And whenever I have a friend who's lost someone close to them, in those days, we didn't have scanners and what have you. I bought a copy, I went home and typed it up. And I send it to those friends of mine who've lost somebody very close to them. And I get tons of thanks. Also, the quote that you chose from that sermon, about 2 years after Reverend Coffin preached that sermon, I lost my last 2 aunts within a couple of weeks of each other. And I asked my Uncle Ted, how is it God lets evil people live to be 103 and good people have to die? And his answer to me was, God is giving the evil people a chance to straighten themselves out. The good people have done their work, and he was well pleased and called them home. And this quote brought that explanation to my Uncle Ted back to me. But it's a wonderful sermon. I think of all the sermons Reverend Coffin did, that one was my favorite.
Thank you, Linda. Well, I was actually researching for this. This is just a little personal aside. I lost my father 10 years ago. It's going to be 10 years in November. So my mom is struggling. 10-year anniversary is a pretty big one. And she's, you know, she's feeling very sad. And as I was researching for this class, I actually gave her this sermon. I was like, I think this would really, really help. It helped me when I was researching it. It was really touching. So again, I wanted to bring a personal one because we've talked a lot about a lot of sermons that had a sort of a national impact. But this one I think has a really personal impact. And it's, I mean, he preached this in the 80s in 1983. And people today are still, you know, myself included and my mother are still learning and having comfort from it. So it's, you know, I think it's a really great one.
Yeah, it was a beautiful sermon, totally beautiful.
Yeah. So we do have one other question in the chat. Please repeat the years that Reverend Coffin served. He was from 1977 to 1987. Okay. So now we'll go to Dr. Forbes. Okay. Let's see. So, and Dr. Forbes, I'll just give the years 1989 to 2007. So James A. Forbes Jr. was the first African-American senior minister at Riverside. He previously worked as a professor of teaching at Union Theological Seminary. He has a lot of papers there, archival papers. And he worked there for 13 years, so he was right across the street. He was born in the South, and he came from a long line of family preachers. He was raised Pentecostal. Forbes characterized his mission at Riverside as giving the congregation a, quote, spirituality for activism. So by doing so, he continued Riverside's history of activism, but also deepened the spirituality of activists and tried to bring evangelicals, or what he called evangelicals, who had separated their spirituality from politics back into the fold. His sermon topics often included being born again, prayer, healing, loving enemies, confession, and encouragement. In terms of politics, Forbes was involved in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, which he spoke about in his sermons early on in his tenure. I'm sure many of you remember this. One in particular was the Sunday following his installation as senior minister, so he kind of just dove right in. His advocacy for the anti-apartheid movement culminated in a visit by Nelson Mandela in 1990. And we will cover that in a later class. It's really special. And we just, a little plug on the Riverside website in the archive section, Vince wrote a really great article. He did some research, and we have some archival materials up there about that, that visit. But check that out, and also we'll go over it again in a future class. Another of Forbes's focus was on the eradication of poverty. In 1995, he delivered a sermon called Affirmative Action for Rich and Poor, and he asked Riverside why it had not made it a part of its mission to emancipate the poor from their plight. In 1997, he delivered the sermon Emancipation from Poverty on the weekend of the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday celebration. He offers suggestions Riverside might undertake to battle poverty, including job development programs, joining with corporate America for job training, and establishing a committee concerned with welfare reform. Following the sermon, President Clinton came to Riverside to discuss poverty in the nation, and we'll likely also address that visit in another class. In terms of style, Fosdick was a narrative biblical preacher who began his sermon with a biblical text and then delved into a contemporary retelling of it. After the end of the sermon, listeners often reported being uplifted and energized. Now, you may have noticed that for this week, the handouts did not include anything from Dr. Forbes. And Craig Lemley actually emailed me. I actually struggled when I was sending out the email. I was like, do I write why I haven't included Forbes, or should I address it in the class? And then Craig ended up emailing me, and it's a really great question on why we don't have that in the handouts. And here's why. We actually don't have printed transcripts of Forbes's sermons in the Riverside archive. The format we do have are audio tapes and various forms of video. These formats are obsolete, and we don't have the playback equipment for them. And so you can see here on the photo here, this is just like 1, 2, 3 columns in one of our archive rooms. And it's like 3 out of, 12 columns of material that we have in these formats. You can see this is a box here. And we have all the sermons. You see it right here. Sermon December 19, 2004, December 12, 2004. We have every sermon, but it's on audio. And this is a real problem that archivists face with materials from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. I'm going to kick it to Vince to talk about this because he's an expert in audiovisual archiving. But yeah, he'll let you know a little bit about our struggles. And then I'm hoping after he speaks, perhaps some of you can share your experiences listening to Dr. Forbes preach, since we don't have that material. But go ahead, Vince.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to open it up to questions at any time, but I just really briefly, what's kind of incredible about our archival collection at Riverside is just how broad the formats are, how many different kinds of formats. I've joked to Diane many times before that if you wanted to teach a class about audiovisual preservation, the Riverside Archive would be the perfect laboratory for that, because it's just every single kind of format of audio and video is in there, which is exciting and interesting, but it also presents a huge hurdle for us in terms of being able to actually see and experience all of this great historical material we have. So going back to the very beginning, we have recordings of very early Fosdick sermons on old acetate records, even creating vinyl records. They were these acetate records, or sometimes called glass records, which were even bigger and like 14 inches wide. these huge, heavy glass records. And so a huge amount of his sermons are on those. And we don't have the playback equipment for that. And also the just over time, the environment degrades these things so much as it's really like it's like a thin layer of this like plasticky acetate sitting on top of sometimes a cardboard base. So as heat and humidity over time expand and contract, all of the actual material sitting on top just cracks off and splinters and powders off. So fortunately, a lot of those Fosdick sermons were transferred at some point to 1/4-inch audio tape, which is where one of the other big chunks of our sermon collections are all on this 1/4-inch audio tape, which was popular from the 1950s up through 80s and 90s, and is still used in audio recording in studios and stuff like that. So that's kind of fortunate because the playback equipment is much easier to find for that, and it's a somewhat more stable medium. There's still problems with it. There's a thing, it's called a vinegar syndrome or sticky shed, and it, again, heat and humidity and time and dust build up on this tape, and the material on which the actual magnetic information is stored on the tape is starts to come off in this sticky crud that sticks to the tape machine. And the way that you deal with it actually is you bake the tape. You literally put it in an oven and you bake it at a certain temperature for a certain amount of time, and then you have one chance to transfer that via a regular tape machine, because the baking it actually damages the tape, but it does temporarily make it so that sticky material doesn't come off onto the tape machine. And then finally, something that we're hoping to deal with very soon is we also have big collections in video cassettes and audio cassettes. We have a large audio cassette. You can see it here on the left. We have a large audio cassette collection, and we also have a large videotape collection. Videotape is unfortunately a very unstable medium. It was not intended to last more than 10 or 20 years. Not only does it have the same problem with the tape that audio tape has, where the material on it breaks down and becomes sticky over time, but also the actual mechanism inside the videotape, the sort of plastic reels inside inside those, they fall apart very easily. But also, unlike the audio tape, it's much harder to find some of these old videotape machines. This is not just VHS. We actually have very little VHS, which was the much more popular format of videotape. We have a lot of beta tapes and just these other kinds of odd formats, which are mostly used for filming, but were not ever widely used commercially for like residential or home use. So finding those machines and finding people who can repair those machines is nearly impossible. So all that is to say that we're fortunate in that a lot of our older sermons were transcribed and published in pamphlet form routinely. And so those are very easy for us as archivists to track down and find. We have huge boxes of just leftover sermons from Fosdick and from McCracken and from Campbell. But these later sermons, especially from Forbes, when mostly we were just capturing these on videotape, are trapped in these really outdated videotape formats. And it can be really hard for us to even track down what some of these sermons were, when they were preached, let alone even see them or hear them, because we don't have a beta tape machine. We don't have these sort of outdated videotape machines or audio cassette machines. So that presents a huge challenge to us as archivists to be able to, sort of keep track of this material and take care of it. Fortunately, we're hoping, we've applied for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to hopefully preserve and digitize our videotape collection. We're still waiting to hear back from them. It's a long process that they have to go through to read our application and so forth. But we're hoping that as we're finishing up our current project to digitize and preserve our audio tape collection, we can then move forward into the videotape collection and start trying to really take care of that and keep track of where all that is, and transfer to digital so that it can be seen by anyone.
Mhm. And then I'll also add that in addition to sort of these audio visuals, digital is also a problem. It's something that we're facing now, you know, for the senior ministers in the past few years. Like, you know, we don't have Braxton's, we don't have any of his information, any of them. I mean, we stopped at Forbes because he was the last one to have a really long tenure, but the previous ones, and even Amy Butler's, who, as you know, just left Riverside last year, we have to figure out how to archive her sermons, and they're in a digital format, and that presents its own sort of problems, because digital can be very, very tricky, and file formats go obsolete, apps, and the materials to play them on your computer, a lot of them are proprietized. So, you know, that's just a really big issue that we face. So do you have any questions? I'm going to just address some in the chat. Is there a transcript of Nelson Mandela's sermon? I don't think so, but you can see it online. There's a YouTube video. So if you go to that, so go to the TRC website, there's a tab that says archives, history and archives. If you go there, you'll be able to see the article that we wrote, and then the link to that YouTube video is there. So you can at least see that. And that video was not put up by us, right, Vince? I think it's.
Yeah, there's actually, there's several out there. There's one that TRC has on our YouTube, which is just sort of some clips.
Like an homage clip.
But if you do a little Googling, you can find some other versions of it. We're hoping that the original version of that appearance is included in our videotape collection. And so that's partly what we're hoping. That's one of the, you know, one of the holy grails amongst our videotape collection that we're hoping to find if we're able to get this grant to move forward with digitizing and preserving the videotapes. I'm sending the link to the Mandela page.
Thank you, Vin. Penelope, can I buy Fosdick sermon pamphlets from you? I'll email you directly about that. We'll talk about that offline, about getting materials. Craig, how much would this cost to digitize? Hundreds of thousands of dollars. So
Hundreds of thousands of dollars, yes.
The one that the project that we have almost completed for a lot of our WRVR audio, I think the grant total was $360,000, something like that.
Yeah.
So hundreds of thousands of dollars to digitize.
Yeah, it'd be similar for the videotapes, and then probably somewhat less for the audio cassette tapes, and then probably significantly more for transferring the those acetate discs I talked about that were all of the early Fosdick sermons. We hope and believe that most of those were transferred to the 1/4-inch audio tape at some point in the 40s or 50s, and so that fortunately hopefully we would not actually have to digitize those acetate tapes, because that's a very expensive and a very new process. There's only a few companies offer this program, which is called Irene. And basically what they do is they are able to photograph these old vinyl or acetate records, and then they use a computer program which turns the photographs into the audio by you know, the computer program is able to be like the needle running through the grooves of the vinyl record, and is able to recreate the audio. So yeah, those would be the most expensive, of course, because they're older, and this is a very new process for digitizing them. We're hoping that by and large, those sermons have already been transferred to the 1/4-inch audio tape, which is much less expensive to digitize and preserve.
Yeah, but in addition to like monetary costs, it also costs, it's like capacity, people to do the work, people to make
Yes.
it accessible, because if we digitize, 1,000 audio tapes, how are you all ever going to find it if we don't catalog it correctly and make sure that they're digitally
Yes.
preserved well, and storage space that costs money as well. So it's a it's a conundrum we're in.
Yes.
Our field is actively trying to figure it out.
Yes.
Okay, so I see we've got a couple hands raised. I know that John raised his hand as well. So see, John, do you want to?
Just one thing about the Nelson Mandela service. It was a huge event because it was his second appearance in the United States after he got out of prison. The first was at the White House, and then it was at Riverside. So the press contingent was 400 for that event. So I'm quite sure there's a lot of coverage that you'll be able to find online about it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we really, really want for that event is to have our coverage in it, in these videotapes, because one of the other issues is copyright. So if, one of the press outlets has, somebody, thank goodness, put it on YouTube. And so it's on YouTube, it's publicly accessible, but a lot of other materials, like from, press agents or companies, they copyright the material and they make it very difficult or expensive to get. So, but thank you. Yes, we will go over that event in another class, because it's a really big one. Linda Lewis, you have your hand raised.
Yes, just a question. Is it possible, is there any program out there where you could transfer? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, is there any program out there where you can transfer an audio or a video item into text? I know that there's something where you can take your digital music, transfer it to MP3 to get it onto your computer. But is there a way, say, if you had a tape of Reverend Forbes' sermons, because I have a machine that will do that. You put the tape in the machine and you plug the machine into your computer, and you can get that onto your computer. Is there a way, once you do that, to get it into text? Or
yeah. So actually, we are working currently with the American Archive of Public Broadcasting on our current project to digitize and preserve our audio tapes, and they have a program which was originally designed by the New York Public Library, which does something very similar to that. The issue with that actually is that computers are not very good at that. They're still very dumb about that, especially if there's even a slight accent. For example, when it was going through Martin Luther King's speeches, I mean, he has that beautiful Southern drawl. It couldn't tell a lot of what he was saying because it's really trained on a very narrow set of accents and sounds. So it's a very new technology, but we have actually been hopefully, I can share it in a moment with the chat, but we've actually been recruiting volunteers to help us correct those transcripts for the audio we're currently working on. So yeah, theoretically, we could do something like that with the videotapes and audio tapes from later on as well. That future project would not be with American Archive of Public Broadcasting, but I would hope that we would be able to find some version of the program that they use to automatically transcribe, and we could hopefully do something similar where we, crowdsource some volunteers to help us, correct those transcripts.
Yeah, for some reason, I seem to have lost the video of the meeting altogether. So there is no program now that one could purchase for a reasonable amount of money that could transfer, say, Reverend Livingston's sermon on Eleanor into sound. I know how to save the video onto my computer, but I'd love to have it for sound, for text rather, to send it to other people that I know. So there's no program out there to transfer those videos to text.
I know that journalists use some kinds of transcription software. I'm not certain how robust it is, or how good it is, or if it would even really be much faster than transcribing it by hand. But yeah, I mean, there are some computer programs like that I know journalists use for quickly automatically transcribing speech to text.
Okay. See, there's no way, even if you put it into text, there's no way I can see it, because I can hear you, but I can't see a thing at this point. I'm totally lost.
Can everyone else see? Yes? Okay. Yes, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Linda, I'm not sure what happened.
Okay.
Yeah, what do you all see? Because I ended the slideshow and I see all of your faces. Is that what you see as well? Yeah, okay. Sorry, Linda, I'm not sure what happened on your end.
Okay.
But you can email us and we
Okay.
can talk about this more, and we can see.
Yeah, because if there's a program out there that's reasonably good, I would like to inquire about it.
Okay, great. And then we have Stephanie. You have your hand raised. Would you like to add something or ask a question?
Yes. Excuse me if I'm not quite on point, as it were. Did you say that we do or do not have printed copies of Forbes's sermons?
We do not.
That's what I thought. I'm a little puzzled about this, because when I came to Riverside in the early 90s, after almost every Sunday service, you would go down to the gift store and they would say, to get an audio cassette of this sermon, do such and such, and to get a printed copy of this sermon, do such and such. And that was there for a long time, that offer after the service to get a printed copy of the sermon.
John, I see you have a comment.
No, you're mistaken. I was on the worship commission when Dr. Forbes first arrived at Riverside, and he personally made the decision that they would stop issuing written copies of his sermons, and they would only be available on audio tape. That was his decision.
Oh, so we don't have printed copies.
There was nothing in the gift shop. There were audio tapes. After the service, you could immediately get an audio tape of just the sermon. If you wanted the full service, you had to wait a week.
Maybe that's what I was thinking about, or maybe there were printed copies of something else.
There were printed copies of sermons from prior clergy, but not Dr. Forbes.
Maybe that's what I had confused them with. And this is to our archivist. Is there no chance that Dr. Forbes would be willing to offer those at this later point in time?
So yeah, I can address that. And then this kind of ties into a question that also came in the chat. Is getting Reverend Forbes transcribed a lost cause? Or are we hopeful that will be possible one day? We're hopeful that it will be possible. And then the other, again, so Vince talked about a lot of the audio. So it's difficult, it's expensive, but there are grants out there and funders who might possibly be able to help us. And Dr. Forbes himself, as you know, is still alive, and he's
I know.
still involved with the church in a very distant capacity, but sometimes he comes. He came, he preached very recently. And so he has his own papers that he is hired somebody to organize, so kind of his own personal archivist. And we had been working with this person prior to COVID beginning in transferring materials. And for what I saw, there weren't printed transcripts, but there were transcripts of his sermons that he had written down. So the notes and his actual written, I guess, what he read from when he gave the sermon. And so those would be really helpful. That's a little problematic because they're handwritten. So then somebody, computers don't do well with handwritten, but they would be something. But because he is still alive, they are his papers that he currently still sort of owns, and it hasn't gone to the archive yet. Again,
well, is he happy about sort of sharing and cooperating with this, or is he very prioritized? And
no, he is. Yes, right before COVID happened, and we kind of the world shut down, Vince and I were actively working on his papers with the person he hired to take care of them. And we were going through things, boxing things up, and then all of that had to come to a halt. But again, I didn't see anything that was like printed pamphlet form. It was only handwritten stuff.
Because it would seem like it would be in his best interest to have whatever printed copies are going to emerge come out in his lifetime, so that he can look at them and correct them, rather than leaving it up to, historians of the next generation to just listen and put it down the best they can. And surely we would say he realizes that. Is that not the case?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. He's been working with us. So he's yes. And it's so interesting because he is such a huge figure in Riverside history, but in the archive, again, because of the nature of the materials and sort of the recent nature of his ministry, we don't have a lot in the archive. And it's strange, but it's kind of a reality. I always used to joke that archives or history stopped in the 80s because people just kind of stopped collecting things after then. And they're like, oh, well, we're in contemporary times, history's, stops in the 80s. And so when you have materials from the 90s, 2000s, now 2010s, they're in different formats or they weren't collected. And so we're trying to go back and recover that material. So that's something we're actively working on. And he has been, he's involved with Riverside still, and he's cooperating with us.
He's the senior minister emeritus. Yeah. And thank you, John, for correcting my memory. It shows you how fallible our memories can be. Thank you to John. We miss you.
Thank you. Is there anything anyone wants to mention before we sign off? I know this kind of delved into an archives rather than Forbes discussion, but I think it's an important one because without the materials, later historians aren't going to be able to look back on his ministry, and it's something we're really trying to salvage.
Yeah, I could jump in really quick, Diane, just about that final question we had about whether we think the Forbes audio would be recoverable. From what I've looked at of the videotape collection and the audio tape collection, I think a lot of it is in very good shape. The issue is just the tremendous cost of reformatting and digitizing all this various material. I mean, it would even be somewhat easier if it was all on one format, but it's on so many different formats. It's on every type of videotape conceivable, even types of videotape that most people don't know exist, like reel-to-reel videotape only existed for a very few years and was only used by professionals. But we have several reel-to-reel videotape reels and stuff like that. So it's every type of media conceivable. So it's going to be a complex and years-long process to even just reformat some of this stuff over into digital. And then on top of that, much more time even more time than that to transcribe and catalog all that material and be able to make it public and, to ensure that the copyright claims are, on the up and up, and that we're not publishing something that belongs to somebody else and stuff like that. So it's a very complex process. And so I'm very hopeful that especially the Forbes material is in good shape as of now. It's just trapped on a format that we don't have any means of accessing, basically.
And we've got to get to it now, because in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, I mean, that's a short amount of time in archive world. It's going to be endangered. So
Yes,
we're actively working on it.
Yeah, these videotapes, especially these are considered in audiovisual preservation, which is sort of what my field is. These sorts of videotapes, these non-VHS videotape formats are considered basically the highest risk, not only because there's actual problems with the media itself that can degrade, but also because there's so few machines that you can play them back on. And not only that, the few people that know how to repair those machines are dying out and so forth. So there's a really limited pool of people who even know how to use and manage and maintain the machines that you need to play these things. So it's a really pressing issue. And that's why it was sort of the first grant that we went for immediately following this audio tape grant, was trying to get these videotapes reformatted, because it is a pressing preservation issue.
Penelope has said in the chat, it sounds like Forbes is publishing his sermons in a book. I hope so.
Make our job easier.
I hope so, and that would make it widely available. That would be great if he did, but yeah, we haven't spoken to him since the world kind of went astray. So hopefully when things are up and running again, we can actively get his materials in one way or another. We'll surely buy his book if he publishes one. Okay, so I think it's 2:54. Thank you for bearing with us. I think this was great discussion in this course, and thank you again, Dr. Harper, for coming and giving us your perspective. It's always great to have an expert look at the material. It's very fascinating stuff.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you for the archival work. It's this thankless task that means so much, not only to this generation, but later ones. And I'd also thank the group here. You noticed how many of our questions were about, well, how did people react to this? Or how did people respond to this? I would encourage us all to think about ways we can preserve the people's opinions who didn't have the pulpit and the microphone to. Because let me tell you, if you're a historian and you stumble upon some sort of ability to access how people responded to this stuff, oh my gosh, that's a gold mine, more precious than silver if you can find something like that. So all of these, trying to put together this whole landscape is really important. So thank you, Diane and Vince, so much for your work.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you next week. I know some of you emailed me about the link. It's the same link every week. So I just encourage you to save this one and just use it for the rest of the class. If there are any changes, of course, I'll email you beforehand. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your day.